Welcome, everyone. I'm Hannah Weissman, the Executive Director of the Magnus Collection of Jewish Art and Life, and I'm delighted that you've all joined us this evening for what promises to be a really fascinating lecture. Tonight's program is offered in conjunction with our current exhibition, In Plain Sight, Jewish Arts and Lives in the Muslim World, which is co-curated by the Magnus curator, Francesco Spagnuolo, and Dr. Kamar Adamji, who's a visiting curator. And if you haven't had a chance to see the show yet, I invite you to step into the gallery next door to this room to do that, or to return another time to be able to really take your time through the show. I'd like to thank the Center for Jewish Studies for collaborating and presenting this program with us. And without further ado, I will turn the podium over to the Center for Jewish Studies Director, Faculty Director, Ethan Katz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you all for being here. Thanks so much to Hannah Weissman and Francesco Spagnuolo and the whole staff of the Magnus and the institution for hosting this event and for our ongoing terrific partnership together. The exhibition at the Magnus, In Plain Sight, that Hannah referred to, is a remarkable, beautiful exhibition. And if you haven't seen it yet, I urge people to check it out. And yes, it is a great impetus for us to bring tonight's speaker. My actual full title is the Helen Diller Family Director of the CJS, and I mention that because this is the annual Diller Lecture, and that title reflects something awfully important in terms of the tremendous significance of the generosity of the Diller family to the intellectual life of the Center for Jewish Studies. And so I just want to take a moment to say a word about that. We're fortunate to have many generous donors to the CJS, but the Diller funds, which were given more than a decade ago, have really enabled us to build a thriving center for Jewish studies that has significant and growing national reputation as a center for teaching and scholarship. Faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students all receive important support for research, for language study from the Diller funds. Diller funds support some of the courses that we teach. They support a range of speaker programs, most notably tonight's annual lecture, which each year we bring a major scholar of Jewish studies who's a leading presence in their field to give a lecture on a topic of broad scholarly and public interest. And I'm delighted that for this year's Diller lecture, we got our first choice, my colleague and friend, Orit Bashkin. Orit's a historian who works on the intellectual, social, and cultural history of the modern Middle East, and who's also become a leading scholar of the Jews of Arab lands in modern times, in particular Iraqi Jews. Orit earned her PhD at Princeton after receiving her BA and MA degrees at Tel Aviv University. And since 2004, she's been a professor of modern Middle Eastern history in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, NELC. We have a MELC department here, so it's basically the same thing, at the University of Chicago. Orit is the author or co-editor of 5 books across a range of topics in Middle Eastern and Jewish history. Her publications deal with Iraqi history, the history of the Arab cultural revival movement, the Nahda, in the late 19th century, the connection between modern Arab history and Arabic literature, as well as Iraqi Jews, the, quote, Arab Jewish experience more broadly, Iraqi Jewish migration to Israel, Jews in travel, interactions between European and Arab Jews in the modern era, and much more. And I just want to say a word about what I find to be remarkable and special about Orit's scholarship. The combination of topics and contributions that she works on is quite rare. She has total bona fides and comfort in the field of Middle East studies broadly conceived, questions of Arab culture and Arab nationalism and Arab intellectual life, and that in many ways is the intellectual world on which she cut her teeth originally as a scholar. And she's now become one of the most important scholars of Jews in the Arab world in modern times, which is really its whole own field and which often operates as a kind of siloed enclave. And I think that Orit's way into this second field and the way that these two fields have a kind of cross-fertilization in her work is part of what has made her scholarship so effective, original, and influential. Her first book is entitled The Other Iraq, Pluralism and Culture in Hashemite Iraq, published by Stanford in 2009. And this is a book that gave, in many ways, I think, the first really complex portrait of the early decades of state and society in Iraq after the establishment of the British mandate there. And especially because it used sources from Sunni, Shiite, Kurdish, and Jewish inhabitants of Iraq to paint a highly textured portrait of Iraqi society, of an Iraqi project of society and nation building. I suspect that the sort of emphasis on pluralism was part of her way into focusing on specifically Iraqi Jews. And her second book is the now classic New Babylonians, A History of Jews in Modern Iraq, published by Stanford in 2012. And this is a book that gave us sort of the most detailed and panoramic portrait of Iraqi Jewry in modern times that we have, remains an authoritative study, and also that dealt in really thoughtful ways with many of the hardest questions in the history of Iraqi Jews. Just to take two examples, Orit has this wonderful chapter on Arab Jews, where she really takes on what was a very thorny debate at that time about were there Jews that should be called Arab Jews? What does it mean for them to be Arab Jews? And really gives us this very careful exposition of what it meant to be an Arab Jew. And she also has a section on the Farhud, this terrible pogrom during World War II in Iraq that has sometimes been treated in very polemical ways by both those most critical of the Iraqi Muslim government and those most defensive of them. And she deals with it in this, very careful, granular, archival way that has brought a lot of light to that subject. Her third monograph is another pioneering book called Impossible Exodus, Iraqi Jews in Israel, published again by Stanford in 2021. And this offers us an incredibly subtle and rich portrait of the experience of Iraqi Jews coming to Israel in the 50s and 60s, their experiences of being isolated, their experiences of creating cultural products. She looks at a ton of sources from these villages and towns where they lived in isolation, showing us the way that they created still a rich cultural life and a certain kind of cultural resistance there. And a lot of this was really unknown, particularly from the voices of Iraqi Jews themselves. So I think you can probably already hear in this that Orit engages in a field that is filled with polemics without entering into polemics herself. I've heard people with completely different ideological presuppositions characterize Orit's work as proving their point about questions and debates between Jews and Arabs. And to me, this is a sign of a scholar whose work really opens up conversations and makes readers feel that there's a way into their work. And that same kind of spirit of openness and generosity I've found to characterize my conversations with her over a number of years and the way that I've seen her interact with colleagues and students. So it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Orit to Berkeley. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Ethan, for this really wonderful and generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here, seeing old friends and new friends. My own mentor, Sasson Somer, delivered the Diller lecture many years ago, and I was sitting in the audience. And for me, in particular, to deliver this talk, surrounded by many people whose work I admire, is quite an important moment in my career. So thank you very much for this opportunity. My research question deals with the Jewish communities in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and I look at them from the 16th century until the 19th century. I ask how religious minorities understand the politics, histories, and religions of the majority community, and I zoom in particular on how Jews saw Ottoman and Arab victories as part of a divine Jewish order. So I'm trying through that to understand ideas of sovereignty and political belonging of Jews in the Muslim world, arguing that Jews sensed a sense of belonging to this world prior to the 19th century and prior to the constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire itself. The project looked in particular at historical memory, how historical memory is shaped, how it changes over time, and it intervenes in our ideas of temporality. So the idea that the past leads to the present, leads to the future in a linear way. I want to think more in more complicated ways about these relationships. The way I do it is by looking at a particular Jewish holiday that was celebrated in the Arab provinces. It was celebrated in Algiers, in Tripoli, in Cairo, in Hebron, in Tiberias, in Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, and Basra. And this holiday is called the second Purim or the minor Purim. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the holiday of Purim. There's another holiday called the minor Purim or Purim Katan, which Jews all over the world celebrated to commemorate a miracle that happened to them. They were saved from a great calamity, a pogrom, a natural disaster. Jews write a special Megillah that tells the event in a way that is very similar to the book of Esther, or they write a liturgical poem called Mi Kamocha Ve'en Kamocha, who is like you and nobody is like you, modeled on a famous liturgical poem by Yehuda Levi from the 12th century. And so the book that I'm writing right now and about which I'm going to tell you looks at these at the histories of these holidays from Algiers in 1541 to Cairo 1524 all the way until 1860 in Damascus. So my arc, and you can look at this, the story of Jews in the Arab provinces in the Ottoman Empire through Ottoman court record, through Arab chronicles. The way I look at this history is to look at sources and archives that are written in Hebrew and Arabic and in Judeo-Arabic from the 16th to 19th century. So these Megillot, these scrolls that the Jews wrote, liturgical poems, letters, travel accounts, chronicles, and trying also to decolonize a particular archive. So not to see every mentioning of the land of Israel or movement of Jews to the Middle East as kind of producing what happens in the 20th century, but rather look at it within its proper Ottoman context. So just to give you an example, this is all written in Hebrew. Although none of it in Hebrew characters, although none of it is actually Hebrew. So this is a prayer that you also have in the Christian tradition, Our Father is in heaven, Abana alladhi fis samawat, this is Judeo-Arabic. This is the Passover Haggadah, Chad Gadya, that is translated into Judeo-Arabic, Wahad Jaddi, Wahad Jaddi. This is Ladino novels, Salvatore Paolina. This is the Judeo-Persian epics that are very different from histories that are written in the Ottoman Empire at the time. They're very poetic, they're very mythical, so very, very different from the chronicles that I work with. So what is my argument? And I'll take you through the periods. So in the 16th century, Jews settle in the Middle East, in the Arab provinces of the Middle East, not just, they settle in the Ottoman Empire. And since many of them are exile or refugees from Spain and Portugal after they've been deported from these places in 1492 and 1496, they really admire the Ottoman Empire for having them there. And in particular, you find in chronicles much admiration for Sultan Selim and Sultan Suleiman. So Selim, for example, is called in Hebrew Sultan Shalem. Shalem means whole, but it also means the name of Jerusalem, and it is Yerushalem. And Selim is the Sultan that conquered Jerusalem. In the Purim of Cairo, Suleiman or Suleiman the Magnificent is compared very often to Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. So this is a period where Jerusalem is renovated, where there are Jewish diplomats in the Galilee, and Jews very much support Ottoman centralization efforts. So the way the temporalities work at the time is, on the one hand, they kind of read the biblical past into the present. The sultans are like biblical kings, Jerusalem is being renovated, but at the same time, there's also a linear perception of history. The Spaniards will not come back. They're now in a new empire, in a Muslim empire, and this is where they live. And so we get this excitement also from travel narratives, for example, by Italian Jews who describe the region, who send letters. So this is Moses Basula on Damascus, very soon after the Ottoman conquest, writing very, very enthusiastically that Damascus is bigger than Bologna, and you can make business there, and you can work there in silk, and they have all these industries, and it's a wonderful, wonderful city. A few decades later, still in the 16th century, David de Rossi writes about Safa, that it's an era of reforms, that they plant trees, that the number of people grow daily. So again, they're very, very interested in what's happening around them, and that influences also Jews who live, broadly speaking, in Ottoman Palestine. These are different provinces, but again, Safa rises as a very important center. Tiberias grows as a very, again, important city, and the villages around it, under the patronage of two Sephardi Jewish diplomats and businessmen and bankers, Dona Grazia Mendes and Don Yosef Nassi. Now, one of the arguments in the book is that when we think about divisions in the Jewish world, we actually think about Ashkenazim, the Jews of Europe, and Sfaradim, the Jews who descended from Spain after they were expelled. But if you actually look at the dynamics in places like Tunis or Palestine or Syria, you actually see quite a different dynamics. So first of all, there were Jews who lived in these regions before 1492. They were Arabic speaking, they had different traditions than the Spaniard Jews, they were involved in local commerce, they had connections sometimes with the local authorities, and sometimes they're called Toshavim, Ezrachim. In the Levant, they're called Mustaribin or Mustaribun, so those who have the Arabic culture. Then we have the Spaniard Jews who come in 1492, who adopt Arabic, who have links to Sfaradim who ended up in England, France, the Netherlands. They're doctors, they're businessmen. And there's a third group of Maghariba, of Jews from North Africa. So the dynamics here, again, are not between European Jews, Spanish Jews, but especially as you go deeper to the Levant, to North Africa, you see dynamics between groups that today all fall under the rubrics of the Spaniards. And that influences Jewish culture. Perhaps the most noted poet of the time is a poet that lived in Damascus, Safed, and Gaza called Israel Najara. And he really revived the tradition of the piyutim and the liturgical poem written in Spain, which was very famous and known until today. But what he did is he put Arabic music to these liturgical poems, which were extremely popular, printed across the Ottoman Empire and beloved in the Jewish world until today. But again, the interesting thing is the connection between the environment in which he lives and his poetry. So, for example, he writes a poem that is quite famous called Tama Boy Lagani. Oh, pretty one, come to my garden. But if you look at his book, you see that underneath it says that the music comes from an Arabic song called Yamma Aluli Ja'ani. So Yamma Aluli Ja'ani becomes Tama Boy Lagani, and the music remains until today. And there's actually a very famous Ottomanist, Andrea Titze, who did like an analysis of these poems, because there's Ottoman Sufi poetry is very important in this context. So how does this affect the Purim? In Cairo, they celebrate a Purim where Sultan Suleiman sort of oppresses a local rebel that endangers the Jewish community, and they celebrate the Ottoman victory in 1524-23. In the 17th century, they're very, very excited that the Safavids, that the Iranians at the time, are defeated by the Ottomans, again, because they prefer Ottoman rule, because they have different implementation of laws regarding Jews and Christians. In Algeria, they're very, very excited about the fact that the Spaniards are not able to get to North Africa and conquer Algiers. So the Spaniards try 3 times to get to sort of conquer Algiers, and every time they fail. And Jews celebrate their failures, especially the drowning of the powers of Charles V in a big storm, as a miracle. Now, Algiers was not initially part of the Ottoman Empire. It was introduced to the empire through the activities of pirates and corsairs that later on are integrated into the system. The person that you might know is Khairuddin Barbarossa, sort of the famous pirate that later on becomes leader of the Ottoman Navy. But the same kind of admiration to him and romanticization of this character you find also in Jewish sources. So, for example, in an Italian chronicle, he's described as a wise man, a brave man. He was a successful man, a wild man. His hand is against every man, and every man's hand against him until this very day. So he's described as a modern or early modern Ishmael. And Jews, again, couldn't celebrate more the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor failed in his mission to make Algeria Muslim again. And so they had, 16th and 17th century poetry that celebrated the fact that the Christians were defeated. And this is not about storm, this is not about Ottoman power, this is not about Khairuddin Barbarossa, this is God's own intervention in politics. And the way they sort of did that is to combine 2 poetic traditions that they already had. So one is sort of seeing rains as a blessing. So they talk about rain as coming from the heaven, helping poor people, helping agricultural products. And so rain is a blessing. On the other hand, they were very, very afraid of traveling by sea, especially those who came from Spain. So in their Arabic poetry, they talk about dhalam al-bahar, like the darkness of the sea. And so in their poetry, and again, I translated these poems myself and the Piyutim and the popular poetry, so they talk, God appears in this epic kind of like Poseidon, he is helping the Jews defeat Charles V, he is helping the political order remain as it is. And it's called Purim al-Nasara because, again, the Christians, Nasara in Arabic, were defeated. And the whole story is told like a modern Purim. So Charles V is Haman, he's Amalek. God is playing a much, again, God is moving ships against him. God makes sure that the Christians are fended off. And again, in other holidays, Jews also compare Ottoman sultans to Ahasuerus, to other biblical kings modeled over the book of Esther. Now, things change in the 17th and 18th century where central Ottoman rule becomes less powerful in the Middle East. And at that point, we have rulers, autonomous rulers, that, or semi-autonomous rulers that are nominally loyal to the Ottoman Empire, or at least they negotiate their position in the Ottoman Empire. And so at that point, you have a split Jewish community. Some Jews are actually supporting still a central government. They're like, if we have local rulers, it's bad for us. They will fight between one another. We will lose. But you also have Jews who become quite attached to local elites and local rulers that emerge in this period. So in this period, we find Jews working as sarafbashis, chief bankers, or financial advisors to a variety of people who acquire some degree of independence in the Levant. And the leadership of the Jewish community changes. The chief leader of the community is actually a saraf, is actually this type of bankers. Jews from the 16th century goes to the local courts, whereas in the 16th century, the super important religious duty of redeeming captives is not only applied to Jews who escape from Spain or escape Khmelnytsky, but it also applies to like Jews who live in different Ottoman provinces and are jailed by their leaders. Local rabbis become identified with local saints, and we see kind of the interaction of the Jews into their society by actually decrees of rabbis. So there's one rabbi from Iraq who sort of writes very vehemently to the Jews in his community in the 17th century, in the 18th century, don't sit in coffee shops with Muslims, don't eat the Gentiles' food, especially don't eat their eggs, don't go to their courts, and you realize, without permission, and you realize from that the Jews did all of the above. I want to mention a letter that was written by an Ashkenazi Jew, Avram Gershon of Kitov, who lives in Hebron, in 1746, and this is what he writes. The Gentiles here love the Jews very much, and whenever a Brit celebration or other holidays take place, their notables come and bring happiness amongst the Jews, jumping and dancing amongst them, exactly lahavdil like the Jews. When I arrived here, the minister of the city came to welcome me, and I gave him a good pipe that I got from Istanbul. They love me very much here and say that from the day I came, they had good fortune. When I was honored to finish the reading of the Torah on Simchat Torah, all their wise men came to rejoice with me, including the high officials, and they danced like the Jews, give praises in their tongue, the Arabic tongue. Now, another important sort of phenomenon that happens in the early modern period is the vernacularization, here I said it, of Arabic. So there's an argument that sort of suggests that after the Jews were expelled from Spain, the role of Arabic as a language of eloquence, of fasaha, sort of declines, and Hebrew becomes the lingua franca, because you have Jews who speak Greek, and Jews who speak Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, and Jews who speak Arabic, so you need, and Ashkenazi Jews, so you need this glue that is Hebrew. And that is true, but you can also not imagine that there are Jews who live in the Middle East, engage in commerce, and don't speak the language of their neighbors. So even the Jews who come from Spain and speak Ladino also learn some degree of Arabic. They might not write in it, but we know that they spoke it. One of the most interesting men in the 16th century was a Moroccan scholar, or Maghrebi scholar rather, called Istaskhar ibn Susan, who was born in Fez, and eventually found himself in Safad. And he produces a translation of the Bible into Arabic that is in much more simplified form, that is very close to the local dialects. And he has a very smart introduction to this text where he says, we can't rely on the translations of the Bible into Arabic that were produced, way back in the Abbasid period. The kids don't get it. The teachers don't get it. We need something else. And he said, look at the Spanish Jews. They translate the Bible into Ladino, and their kids know it. So we need to find a way to mediate the Bible in different ways. And actually, in the early modern period, we have both sharh, which is an older sort of tradition, which is the translation and the explication of the Bible into Arabic. And we have also something called qissa, which means story, that tells the story of Esther and Joseph in popular forms. So here again, this is already this is later on printed in the 19th and 20th centuries. So you see here the sharh of the book of Echa, again, the translation of the Haggadah into Judeo-Arabic, the 10 Commandments, Ashar al-Kalimat bil-Arabi. So this is all to mediate to Jews the holy text that they have. And it influences also the story of Esther, especially in texts coming from Egypt, where she becomes a completely Egyptianized lady. And if you read the Egyptian Arabic, they call her Yawagil Ammar, and she sounds very Egyptian, less Persian. But that's precisely the point, to make these texts accessible to Jews. Now, these processes of localization actually affect the meaning of these local celebrations. And in the 18th century, all these kind of minor Purims are based on a victory of one Ottoman or local ruler against the other. Specifically, I want to focus on one holiday, which is Purim Tveria, or Purim Tabaria, or Purim Tiberias, which is a minor Purim connected to the victory of a local Bedouin ruler called Zahir al-Umar. Now, he was the autonomous ruler of the Galilee, and his power kind of spreads throughout different parts of Ottoman Palestine at the time. Again, the names of the provinces are not Palestine. I'm just using this as a name to sort of refer to the region, but what I think is crucial here is that he invites, or some people say that this Jewish community invites themselves, but a Jewish community from Izmir arrives to Tiberias, and they're led by a rabbi called Haim ben Yaakov Abu Afia, who was actually born in Hebron, and they established themselves in the city. The Ottomans are not at all happy that this guy is like becoming more autonomous, doesn't send taxes to the city. He's a Bedouin ruler. He builds on these Bedouin connections. And so they send the governor of Syria to, put an end to Zahir's autonomy. And Zahir survives 2 sieges from the Syrians. Rabbi Abu Afia says to his believers, we do not leave the city. We stay here with Zahir al-Umar. God will protect him. And so they stay and they survive the siege. And that was celebrated in Tiberias for many, many years as kind of the local victory of Zahir al-Umar against the Syrians. So from the moment Abu Afia comes to Tiberias, he tries to build Tiberias as a Jewish center. And this is a letter that he writes to a Moroccan colleague whom he tries to sort of seduce to come to Tiberias. So he says, the land here is tranquil and safe, and there are no blasphemers, enemies, criminals, or offenders, to such a degree that we work fearlessly in the streets of the city at midnight. Likewise, the gates of the Jewish street remain open, something you do not find in the streets of Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safad. May they be rebuilt in our times. Amen. But in our holy city of Tiberias, may it be rebuilt in our days. Amen. Nothing of the above occurred. Praise be to God. And we should praise the Almighty for his goodness, especially since God made the minister of the land bestow their grace and kindness on me. And their love for their Jews is a wonderful thing, beyond what words can describe. And so his synagogue is still in Tiberias, if you want to visit. Now, Jews, to commemorate the holiday and also to collect money in Europe, write a local chronicle that is kind of the Jewish Game of Thrones of the time that describes the siege and how they're surviving it. But it's interesting to see how they romanticize this local ruler. So his name is Sheikh Zahir al-Umar, and the Sheikh is famous in all the land. This is because at the time of the Sheikh's reign, the land has become peaceful, while before all roads were dangerous. And the leaders of the towns made him rule over them and call him Sheikh al-Mashayikh, that is the minister of ministers. And the Sheikh is generous with his fortune, his home is open to all, and he shares his bread with people of varying languages and ethnicities. And they even try to sort of explained that he was not a rebel against the kingdom, Orit Bashkin, that he actually, what he did was perfectly fine, and it's all like this dude from Syria who is jealous. And this is part of the chronicle where the rabbi explains to the people of Tiberias like why they should stay in the city, although again, the powers of the Syrian, the governor of Damascus, were immense at the time. Be brave, and strong. God is with us, so fear not. And for the sake of the people of Israel, the non-Jews will be saved as well. For they, the Arab Muslims, are on the city's wall night and day, in the heat of the day and in the cold of the night, to see whenever any of the Syrian governor's men is approaching. So it's like they're defending us. God will protect us. And then again, when these two sieges end with disaster, there's sort of an idea of, redemption, miracle. They're also producing a lot of poems about the beauty of Tiberias. I won't take them there, but it is a Galilean phenomenon. You also have letters from Kfar Yassif, where there was a tiny Jewish community about like how wonderful their life is. These are just some of the inscriptions from Jewish tombstone from that period. So again, local rule is important, again, economically, financially. It's very different from the 16th century, and the miracle moves from the imperial to the local. Then we have another wave of centralization in 1798 to 1882, which is the modern era. So in this era, Jews, especially towards the late 19th century and towards 1908, which is beyond my book, start believing Ottomanism, an idea of civic loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. But since this is also an era of colonialism, Jews also have to deal with the challenge of colonialism that affects them. 1798 Napoleon in Egypt, 1830 Algeria, 1881, 1882 colonization of Tunisia and Egypt, and they live in these places. And so, there is this assumption, which is not this historiographical emphasis, let's say, not assumption. The Jews were sort of, and again, Ethan Katz wrote much more about this than I did, so this is sort of my little intervention here, that Jews benefited from the colonial powers. They had French education, they were mediators, they were translators, they got colonial protection to getting sort of the becoming proteges of foreign consuls. It helped their trade, although in the book we can sort of see that, when the book is written, that in their trading networks to France, to Italy, actually start in the 18th century and even before. So, they benefit from this enterprise. But actually, if you see some of these other sources, you see that Jews are also involved in the anti-colonialist effort as well. They're worried by the anti-Semitism of some of the missionaries. Early on in the 19th century, they're very worried they benefit from Christian Zionism, but they're also very worried once they figure out that these guys want to convert them. They don't necessarily like the idea of the draft. To any army, colonial and otherwise. And so we find in key moments, Jews actually critical of colonialism. Two chief rabbis pray in Jerusalem for the fall of Napoleon. The Jewish rabbi of Egypt strongly supporting the anti-colonial rebellion of Orabi. Jews commenting on the import of European goods and what it does to their livelihood. And so on the right, you see here a poem that was published in Judeo-Arabic that was published by Yosef Shitrit. I translated the Judeo-Arabic into English. I didn't translate the French words because it's a mixture of a lot of words and a lot of languages. But also the fear of secularization, the fear of the fact that Jews will turn away from their tradition because of these new institutions is something that is very relevant to this period. The other thing that is important is that in this period, despite the fact that the Ottoman state is actually saying, let's create a civic identity that, that is applicable to Jews and Christians, we see, because of colonial intervention, because of modern sectarianism, actually a lot of clashes between Jews and Christians. The most famous case is the Damascus blood libel of 1840, where Jews are being blamed by the Egyptian authorities in Damascus at the time, that they killed a priest for ritual purposes. It takes a while to get them acquitted. Not everybody survive. Not all the leaders that were arrested survive the torture while they're arrested. The second Purim of the 19th century, which I study, and again, I studied different holidays at this period, had to do with the 1860 war in Mount Lebanon in Syria. And there's a super important book by my colleague who teaches here, Usama Makdisi, on this moment in history and on the meaning of modern sectarianism that it creates. So the war starts in Mount Lebanon with a horrendous massacre of Maronites by their Druze neighbors, and it spills to Damascus, where Muslim mobs kill thousands of Christians. And the city's Jews sort of remain untouched. The Jewish quarter is not attacked. That is something that is commemorated as a second Purim holiday. The fact that this major sectarian riot in Damascus did not affect the Jewish community. So the first chronicle that is written about this is written by a man called Moshe Siton, and it's called Masa Damascus, or the Burden of Damascus, crying of Tammuz 17, which is where the massacre happened. It's a reference to Isaiah. But you see there in this chronicle a lot of sympathy with the Christians, but also a lot of happiness about the restoration of Ottoman order. So despite the fact that it's abundant with biblical citations, it shows a lot of empathy to the victims, and he used a word to describe what happens to the Christian that has a lot of meanings in Jewish history later on. He uses the word Shoah to describe what happens to them. And we know that this holiday, the second Purim, was celebrated at least until the early years of the 19th century. A Jew from Jerusalem, Eliezer Rivlin, who's exiled by the Ottomans during World War I to Damascus, sort of talks about the fact that the Messene Jews celebrate this miracle. They call it a tosha, the noise, the calamity, and they believe, he adds, that this is God's revenge for the blood libel of 8040. And even meets a guy called Nissim, means miracle, and he's like, yeah, I was born 8060, so they call me Nissim because I'm miracles. But after these sectarian riots, the Jews actually are asked to pay taxation, heavy taxation, for the restoration of Damascus. And at one point, their leaders are arrested under the blame that some participated in the looting. And then you find something else. Then you find the holiday becoming sectarian and deeply, deeply anti-Christian. And there's a poem by a guy called Shalom Mahadib that was written in 8080, that was murdered in 8080, that also circulated in Jerusalem, that is all about gloating to Christian suffering. But unlike the 16th century holiday, where the holiday was sort of like, thank God the Ottomans defeated the Christians, now they're gloating at the suffering of their Christian neighbors, remembering 8040, and living in a highly sectarian city. So again, I won't read to you anything, but they looted Christian fortune, they took their property, they emptied their houses and left no child alive. On the day the Philistines, that's the name that they use for Druze, came with their swords and spears, they burned all the houses of the idolaters and their God. Now, this holiday, again, is quite unique and very, very... we don't have a holiday like that actually celebrates not only the suffering, the saving of the Jews, but also has problematic relationship with the sufferings of Christians. And again, we saw a work of apathy and a work that is sectarian, but deeply, deeply sectarian. But I think the interesting thing here is that the perception of this holiday changes, or not the holiday, the massacre itself, changes completely when it comes to Europe. And you see this all throughout the 19th century. Like Jews in Egypt are like, or some Jews, rabbis, and the chief rabbi in particular, but others are like, Orabi is a great guy, he's defending Egyptian Jews. You have European Jews who are saying, Orabi is a disaster. Thank God that the Brits are there because they will save Jews from sectarian riots. The same is true for 8060. So because it was a global affair, Jews in Russia actually show deep pro-Christian sentiments, and they write about this massacre, and they raise funds to help the Christians in Mount Lebanon and in Damascus. I found out from the Hebrew press of the time that in Pinsk, where my grandmother is from, originally not the most famous city by any means, they also collected money for the Christians. So that relates, to a different Russian context, but you can see sort of the split. So again, I wanted to point out to this history and how, we can't understand the history of Jews who lived in the Arab provinces of the Middle East without actually understanding the broader context, without understanding their networks, and without understanding how God plays a particular role in history and before the era of secularism. This history is still commemorated today in certain very politicized way. In Tiberias, you can go to the Donna Grazia Hotel and dress up as a Spanish Jew or what is imagined a Spanish Jew. Tiberias also has a sort of a mural that presents Donna Grazia Mendes, the famous Ottoman benefactor, and Rabbi Chaim Abulafia. In Safed and in Tiberias, you can still see the early modern synagogues. Zahir al-Umar's fortresses and mosques did not fare the same. Now, I should also say that there's a Middle Eastern history, and sorry for the typo here, that is involved in imagining this event, sort of celebrating the fact that Jews were accepted to the Ottoman Empire. There's a fantastic novel about Zahir al-Umar and his life in the Galilee. Bella Hadid apparently is a descendant, but sort of the main idea here is that, we need to think differently about history writing. So in the 19th century, and in the 20th century, people really celebrated, linear histories where the past leads to the present, leads to the future, that are scientific, that are, easy to decipher, that progress from one event to the other. But I think that the circular and religious histories had important functions in the times of forced migration, besieging of cities and villages during battles for provincial hegemony, the violent transformation to capitalist modernity, to ethnic nationalism, because these processes offer divine patterns through which the most inexplicable could be understood, how the most violent and unjust events were actually part of God's plan. Now, I mentioned to you, the fact that I heard this first Diller lecture when my mentor Sasson Somech gave it. And I want to, since we are living in horrible times, I wanted to read a poem that Sasson Somech's relative, Roni Somech, or Somek, who is a very famous Israeli poet, wrote. Because I think, as this kind of, during these times, I often ask myself, so what does it all mean, today? So this is a poem that he wrote and was translated into English. It's called Gaza Winter 1968. In a restaurant by the sea, my mother and my father, those are Iraqi Jews. I didn't forget Iraqi Jews for 1 minute. My mother and father were having fish. That's what they said. The restaurant were like on the banks of the Tigris in the city where you were born. And in that Abdel Wahab song, that's a famous singer, Abdel Wahab song you're singing right now, not one lyric has changed. The smell of the coffee crept like a smoke from a flame that once swirled on the golden chests of the king's concubines, the monarchs of this place. And I, who felt the prick of the surviving bone from the fish's heart, already knew that the wooden flags of the table on which the white tablecloth had been laid shall never recover from the sow's teeth that bite into them. Right, so they're sitting in Gaza after it was occupied, and the Iraqi Jewish parents say, this is the same, same music, same culture. But culture is not enough in the context of occupation. He himself feels that the fish that is taken from the Sea of Gaza has a heart, and the heart is beating, and that the wooden structure and the white tablecloth will not survive. It cannot survive. So culture can take us only that far. And, this is the place where Israel Najara is buried, in Gaza. He was a judge there, the poet. And this is what it looks like. And during one of these, when I gave this talk, actually in Arabic in Chicago, a friend of mine came to me and said, they're looking for him right now. And I was so devastated to see that, you had some religious people who are now soldiers, and they're saying, like, with every bomb, with every shell, we get closer to this tomb. And to me, that is like the most brutal end of the universe that I am studying. So personally, I hope for a ceasefire. I hope that this crazy, corrupt government of Netanyahu falls. I hope that the hostages are, come back to their families in a deal. But again, I don't think that, like, this kind of history, it can offer us something, but in our violent present, we also need to remember its limitation. But I wanted to end with something less pessimistic. So this is the shrine of Rabbi Chaim Abulafia. And it says here that all his deeds, all his writings are mentioned in this book, in this chronicle that I've mentioned to you, that praises Zahar al-Omar, that praises this kind of relationship. This is still in Tiberias. This is still on the tombstone. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Orit. We have some time for questions. I would ask people to formulate your question in the form of a question, and to remember that we want to give time for lots of people, so try to be relatively concise. I see Valentina over here.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and it's a book that has to be written for a while already, though. So thank you. I have a question about centralization and local authorities. If I understand correctly, 16th century, we mostly see kind of like push for centralization. Then there is a kind of like backdrop to local authorities, and then centralization again. And I wonder if you see at any moment the quick switch in between, kind of like situational expediency, maybe.
So can you repeat that? So if I see the tension in the 16th century between centralization?
Not even in the 16th century, but throughout the whole period, that the same communities are switching between supporting local authorities to centralization.
Yeah.
If you see this in parallel, or it's more like in periods.
So 16th century is definitely the era of centralization. In the 18th century and 17th century, it becomes split, and it depends on which province you live in. So Jews in, let's say, Tripoli, are in North Africa, are very much connected to a dynasty called the Karamanli dynasty. So, they support it. Jews in Basra are very much connected to a sort of a governor, a local governor called Suleiman Pasha, who later on becomes like the governor of the entire province. At the same time, Palestine is actually an excellent example because Zahar al-Omar is very popular in the Galilee. Later on, he kind of makes a deal with an Egyptian governor who is also aided by the Russians to sort of take over sort of all of Palestine. And that is, a huge deal. And the Jews in Jaffa and Hebron suffer tremendously from this attack. So they're not like the folks in Tiberias. They're like, the Ottomans should get this guy and should kick him out. And when Ali Bey al-Kabir, Zahar al-Omar's partner, is kind of caught, there's like a whole big, yay, he's caught, Ottoman government is great. You see it also in travel narratives when Jews visit Istanbul and like how wonderful this is throughout the century. So it's really, it's a decision made based on local interests in the level of the province and sometimes in the level of the city. What's interesting, though, is that some of the governors that the Jews identify as like being, very bad governors and very bad governors to the Jews, you find parallel kind of complaints also in Arabic sources by the Muslims. So it's not entirely detached from local realities.
Other questions?
Yeah?
I'm sort of interested in knowing how many languages you speak.
I'm going to ask you to just use the mic. So,
How many languages do you speak?
Enough to do this project, but most of my sources are in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. So I actually don't read Ladino, and the sources here are they're all the local sources. There's, again, as I've mentioned before, there are other ways to doing it. You can look at Ottoman records. You can look at responsa. So also the sort of sources that I'm interested in are, chronicles and letters, but also I'm very, very interested in something that was kind of often tossed aside, which is popular poetry. So, and popular songs that Jews sang. And for me, I'm not a native speaker, but for me, the challenge in translating this is also to capture the register, right? So when you have piyut, I'm looking at various translations of the Bible into English to kind of capture the best way that they situate it. So I visited a lot of like Bible Hub and whatever during this time. At the same time, when it's like local poetry in Judeo-Arabic or in Hebrew, I wanted to rhyme. I wanted to be more, that it would sound like a natural, like the popular poems that I read. So like, this one is in Judeo-Arabic. So we Jews became cheap goods without no tricks or cunning words. The day will come when they force cancellation, the French, on the Jewish holidays and the mitzvah of circumcision. Is this the reason? What is the reason for all this mess? It is the naturalisation française. I try to capture the bilingualism there. In Tiberias, I try to do something similar with a popular poem. Okay, I will not show you Tiberias. But again, I'm trying, the struggle here is not just with the sources themselves. The struggle is also to convey the multiple register of the classical form of Arabic, the Judeo-Arabic, which is in the dialect. And also, philologically, I was complaining to someone, I think Shaykh Haskani, or someone else maybe, no, someone else, that for me, that I was trained in a particular classical sort of Arabic tradition to try to understand at this later stage in my career, Judeo-Arabic of North Africa was really, really difficult. And thank God that there were all these gifted philologists that already produced a lot of these studies that were really helpful.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. I feel like I'm trying to grasp it all because you've covered so much time and space in such a condensed fashion. And I think the question I have is there some way to try to understand how these varied Jewish communities who are there for various lengths of time in these various locales, and some immigrated there from Spain and some were there before, is there a way to try to systematically think about how their relations and allegiances, why they vary? So for example, why they're on one side of these conflicts in one location, like you're speaking of Tiberias, a different one in Sfat, a different one in Hebron, and it may have to do with when those Jews got to those places and their class positions, or I'm just trying to understand it. It's so complex, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think it has to do with local considerations, and also, what is good for the province in which they live. So in the 16th century, it's pretty clear. Like, we don't want the Spanish, we don't want the Christians, we don't want them near here. We are here in the Ottoman Empire. And it's even more complicated than that, because there's nostalgia to Spain, and there are interesting studies about like how, the idea of being Spanish and Jewish also reemerges in the Middle East. But it's very clear from these holidays, like, Christians out, which is different than European Jews. In the 17th and 18th century, again, it changes, and it's based on the interest of what the Jews think is best for them in that particular moment. And again, this is how it changed in comparison to Europe. So first, the comparison is to Europe. So let's say Napoleon. Napoleon is hailed in many Jewish European sources. In this context, people who are famous are like Haim Fahi of Acre, who helped the local governor there kind of fend off Napoleon. In sources from the time, when Napoleon enters from Egypt, he levels Gaza. And the tiny Jewish community there is completely disseminated. So they're writing about this from the perspective of, what's around. But it's influenced by, local power. So I would say that they're thinking, first of all, what's happening, what's good for them. But also what's good for them is what's good for their neighbors in some ways. And then in the 19th century, again, some of them are printing these 16th century narratives to show that they're loyal to the Ottoman Empire. And some of them, take other routes. They publish in other languages. They have different commitments. So then, again, it becomes more complicated when you have colonialist intervention, imperial reforms. Later on, towards the late 19th century, a period of Arab cultural revival. So each of these things complicate how Jews think about themselves in relationship to their neighbors. But God is always there in some way. God is kind of the motivating power behind the events.
Oh, that was perfect, because I thought I was going to be off topic, but I was going to be about God. But I agree with Ron that it's just such a complex, but I'd say rich, beautiful history. It's just such a wonderful way to go through history. I'm really excited for this book. But it just struck me, if I'm not wrong, I think the book of Esther is the one book in the Bible where God is not mentioned, and yet it's primary in all these texts. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the book of Esther in itself is a very strange creation in the Bible, right? So God is not there. It happens in the diaspora. And rabbis themselves kind of deal with that. So, for example, they ask themselves, okay, so did Esther eat kosher food with Achashverosh? What was she doing? And also like this whole idea of like her uncle tell her, live with this Gentile king because you have to save the Jewish people. So then when they deal with the book of Esther, they thank God, but especially in these chronicles that are built as the book of Esther, you most often have an Achashverosh. And that's Zahir al-Omar or Sultan Suleiman or Murat IV, who is the sultan that took Baghdad back from the Safavids. So that's the Achashverosh. You have a Mordecai sometimes, a Jewish courtier, Abraham Castro in Egypt, who was a very famous courtier, Haim Abulafia in Tiberias. You don't have an Esther. She's taken out. The only place where there was an Esther, and I found an Esther, and that was really cool, was in, again, Tripoli. And she is a very fascinating and very problematic figure. So the ruler there had like a local harem. And she was very much involved in the harem politics. And she also wanted her daughter, who was called Mazel Tov, to be with like a mistress of one of his sons, so he could kill his brother. So he can. It's very soap opera secession-like. And we have descriptions of her by Western consuls and diplomats in this region. She doesn't make it into any of the Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew poetry of the holiday. Because yes, there's an Esther and she's rich and she's actually jailed, and there are a lot of stories about this Esther. I like her very much, but she doesn't fit into this narrative. So in a way, the same kind of problems that they had with the original one, they have even more with that particular Esther. But then when she dies, they write like a beautiful thing about her, that she was a fine woman and things like that. So that's the only Esther I found. So Haman and Amalek is always the enemy. So if it's in Syria, then it's Suleiman Pasha. If it's in, if it's in Tiberias, it's the governor of Syria. If it's in Egypt, where there's a local ruler called Ahmed Pasha, and he rebels against Sultan Suleiman, then he's Haman. So whoever the Jews don't like, that's Haman. That's the guy that should fall. Now I should say that this is within the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. In the United States, you had a Purim Lincoln when the Jews are not kicked out from the South during the Civil War by a decree of Julius Grant. So there is something called Megillat Lincoln that you can find online. So it's not just, and there are holidays like this in Bosnia and Rhodes and Frankfurt. So this is not just a Middle Eastern phenomenon, but I use it to tell a particular story of Jews in the Arab provinces of the Middle East.
Thank you, Orit. I'm so excited for this project. So it seems to me that mapping onto exactly this geography and this chronology is the movement of Shabtai Tzvi.
Yeah.
So he's in Gaza, Istanbul, it's in all the same places, Izmir. So I'm just wondering if you came across, and they were of course making their own antinomian weird holidays and so on. So did you come across any commemorations from them, even if they were maybe challenging Muslim authority as much as they were commemorating it?
So the way the book is structured is that for each holiday I have like an introduction to like what's happening for Jews in this period, and so I found I looked at Sabbatai Tzvi, and some of the Dunmis, some of the Jews who continue to believe in him, actually think about him as Queen Esther, someone who hides her faith in order to survive. And so they're very interested in that. So that's one thing that I thought was interesting. The other thing is that I looked at sort of popular Judeo-Arabic poetry about Sabbatai Tzvi. And it's really interesting. First of all, they call him Sultan Adil, they call him Marsul, like Rasul. So you can actually see in the Arabic how it's very, very similar to the Muslims. And Algeria at the time was a huge Sabbatean center. So you see that the mediation of that is through, Arabic terms and Islamic terms. And then the other issue is that it affects also Jewish patronage. So there's a historian I rely on called Joseph Sambari. His patron was a Sabbatean. So there is a moment where this whole movement collapses, and Jews are completely shocked. And I think that also affects their perception of the 16th century as a golden age before this horrendous crisis. Interestingly, again, Gaza, because it's and where Nathan of Gaza is really an important locale because it's on the way from Egypt, and it connects them to the power, the sort of the powerful elite of Egypt. And lastly, and again, I really don't understand in depth what the Sabbateans are saying. And I think nobody does, and I think that's why they were so popular. But I think that it's interesting that they have, at least in some of the prophecies and things like that, they have a different relationship to the Ottoman Sultan. So first he will fight everybody, and then and he will be like Sabbatai Tzvi's little helper, and then something happens to him. So it's a different kind of relationship to the Sultan and to other things. But again, the most interesting thing for me was the Judeo-Arabic understanding. They call him Mawla, for example. So again, because it's Arab provinces, I was kind of that made the book much easier to write because it doesn't include Morocco and it doesn't include Yemen, but you have this phenomenon in those two spaces as well. But it's a different kind of power.
Thank you so much, Orit. I can't obviously help but thinking through the lens of the present. And it's actually pretty amazing how your project sort of resists sort of presentists and also in some degree Zionist interpretations of the past, right? Because we are looking here and, in Purim Katan, Jews sometimes celebrating self-prescribed jihadi movements, right?
Yeah.
And valorizing them as, resistance, anti-colonial or other resistance. It's very interesting. And of course, in that sense, it's really, really heartbreaking to see. And you mentioned it in passing. I'm hoping that everyone sort of grabbed that, understood that, looking, soldiers in Gaza today.
He's getting there, it's fine.
That are looking for, the grave of one of those Safed rabbis, right?
Yeah.
Today, right, in the context of trying to use the story as an exclusivist sort of Jewish exclusivity in Gaza. So it's really interesting. I was wondering if that's something you can sort of reflect on more, because this really presents a much more messier story of Jewish presence in the Middle East, in the Levant, in the Arab world, as certainly commonly interpreted and presented today.
Yeah, so I had an epiphany 2 days ago. I was talking to students from Georgetown on Zoom, and they have a couple of students from Gaza. Their mindset is different, and they actually read my book on Iraqi Jews in Israel. And I was very moved that people in this stage still have the energy and the time to engage with my scholarship. And then somebody said to me, but Itamar Ben-Gvir's grandmother is from Iraq. So what does that mean? And I told him, that for Palestinian folks who are abused by Ben-Gvir and his minions, it doesn't matter if his grandmother was from Poland, from Warsaw, from Baghdad, or from Kurdistan. The present matters. And again, that's why I read this poem, to sort of say the story has limits. So the reason I tell this story is because this story is so different than what we see today, because of the fact that there was a moment in history when politics look different. Now, I want to also tell it in a way that doesn't romanticize the 18th century, because it sucked living in the 18th century with all these battles between rulers. But I do want to show different thinking about sovereignty, different thinking about relationships between Jews and Muslims. Now, the other thing that I would say is that some of the sources that I use, it didn't take a long archival travel to find them. Some did, but some, Chabad and all these, they scan books like crazy. And so some of the, I don't know if they respect authors right or not, that's a separate question. But some of them I found like this. And Amnon Cohen and a lot of historians of Ottoman Palestine, they knew these sources. They're not hidden in some cave. They're available. The philological work has been done on them, but the political meanings was sort of set aside. So for example, in the case of Egypt, people were really interested in these things because it showed them how people spoke Arabic in the 17th century and in the 16th century. But the fact that Jews called Sultan Suleiman Shlomo Melech, and they did so up until the 20th century, that is kind of set aside. I used to end talks by saying there is still hope and look and different. Now, I'm too depressed. I say this as a story, as a history that is important, and it's important to commemorate it. But I am very modest about what this history can do at present, and hopeless actually. So, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Maybe you asked me something about the 16th century. I don't know, but yeah. But it's important to say this. Yeah.
This is a quick statement, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
But it's related, and it's worth noting, despite all the bad news we hear about Iran and Israel today, that while we're on the subject of Iraqi Jews, and I'm sure you're aware of that, but just wanted to say it, that Iran, the noble Iran under the Shah, was single-handedly saved the Iraqi Jews after they were persecuted because of the establishment of Israel. And it was facilitated through Iran that most of the Iraqi Jews went to Israel and many settled in Iran in the 40s and 50s. Just wanted to make that statement.
Yeah, so for me, it's really interesting to study Iran in this context because Iran, Safavid and Qajar, which is the periods that I mostly study, had really tough laws, especially relating to purity law. It's called tahara or najasa with respect to the Jews. So the Jews in Iraq, actually, in the period that I study, really, really didn't like the Iranian intervention. So the Purim of Baghdad is all about like how the Ottoman Sultan, Murat IV, liberates them from the Iranian regime. And and I felt bad because I gave a talk once and like to very prominent scholars of Iran, and it was about this thing, and they called him like evil Ajam and all sorts of things. So I apologize in advance, but I think in the 20th century, it's a completely different reality, right? It's the Pahlavi regime. It's a modernizing effort. I should also say, though, that there are different relationship between Jews in Iran and Iraq, and I sometimes think about them together with my colleague Lior Sternfeld, who studies Iranian Jews. So, you know, there are also links between communists, so the Iraqi communist and the Tudeh party. So there are also Jews who arrive from Iran to Iraq relatively recent, more recently. So you have families in Iraq like the Dashts and other that originated from Iran. So it's a much more complicated story that doesn't start by any means in 1948.
We've already kept you over time here. I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I think you had a question and you raised your hands a long time, so maybe you should ask your question. Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm hearing you right, the broad picture I get is of relatively harmonious relationships throughout this time, and I'm wondering the extent to which there were exceptions to that.
Yeah, so relationships were not harmonious as the way that these holidays captured them. There were many challenges. You know, this is not a period where you have a concept of citizenship, so and in the modern sense. So obviously Christians and Jews are in a different category than Muslims. And in this period, there are also times where Jews suffer, again, as a result of natural disasters, wars that the sultans take, heavy taxation. And yet, I think that because of, in the 16th century, because of the trauma of the expulsions from Spain, in the 18th century, as they try to kind of live by local governors, they have their own instinct to present an idealized model of politics. Some of them are elite Jews, right? So if you're a doctor from the Hamon family in the Ottoman court, you live a very different, and you're connected to historians, and you give your patronage to them. You have a very different life than, you know, a Jew who lives in a Jewish neighborhood in some city. And again, as I've mentioned before, it changes from one place to the other. So Murat IV, that the Jews of Baghdad really loved, Jews in places like Edirne and Salonika really don't like, because they perceive him as very rigid. He taxes some of their merchants that sell silk and wine. So so the fact that the Jews of Baghdad present Murat IV as Sultan Murat IV as the Superman that saved them doesn't mean that he was, this glorious sultan to everybody. But it's definitely points to something, and you see this. And again, the moments where they really live a comfortable life, I think, is early 16th century. Then it deteriorates quite quickly. But still, you don't have this kind of, again, now I'm idealizing, but you don't have this kind of blood libels, pogroms, and things like that to an extent that you have it in Europe in this period. So I think that's also important to note.
Thank you so much, Orit. You've given us so much to think about. Please, let's thank Orit one more time.